Today, March 10th, the global energy market woke up to a phrase it almost never hears directly from a Gulf state producer: force majeure. Bahrain's state oil company, Bapco Energies, just told every buyer on its contract list, "We cannot deliver. The war reached our refinery." That is not a diplomatic statement. That is not a press release. That is a legal declaration that export contracts are suspended indefinitely. And what makes this hit differently is one detail. Bapco's Sitra refinery is not one of Bahrain's refineries. It is the only one. Around 405,000 barrels per day. Jet fuel, ultra-low sulfur diesel, naphtha, all flowing from one facility that just went dark after an Iranian strike. On March 9th, Iranian attacks hit the Al Ma'amir complex on Sitra Island south of Manama. The Bahrain news agency confirmed material damage and an active fire. Videos on social media showed black smoke rising over Manama's skyline for hours. Every emergency response unit in the kingdom was deployed to contain the blaze. Bapco's force majeure notice stated the company's operations had been affected by the ongoing regional conflict and the recent attack on its refinery complex. Over 80% of Bapco's refined products go to international buyers. When those exports freeze, those buyers do not simply find another supplier. Markets feel it instantly. The same morning, a separate Iranian drone attack struck a residential area on Sitra Island. Bahrain's Ministry of Health confirmed 32 civilians injured, including children, 4 in critical condition. But here's the detail that most live coverage is completely missing. Bahrain is not the first Gulf state to declare force majeure this week. It is the third. Qatar Energy declared force majeure last Wednesday after 2 LNG facilities were struck, sending fresh volatility through global gas markets. Kuwait's state oil company, KPC, followed shortly after, halting crude exports as Iranian attacks cut directly into its refinery and oil field operations. Iraq and the UAE have also been forced to cut output. Qatar's own energy minister had publicly warned that all Gulf exporters would be forced to follow suit within days. He was right. What we are watching is not a single strike on a single refinery. It is a systematic campaign targeting Gulf energy export infrastructure, node by node, one force majeure notice at a time. In my view, this is the most underreported energy story of 2026. The headlines count missiles. The real story is in frozen contracts and oil prices above $100. Brent crude crossed that threshold on March 9th for the first time since 2022, driven entirely by what Iran is doing to Gulf export infrastructure. That is more than a 50% spike in under 2 weeks, from around $73 a barrel before the war began on February 28th to above $100 by March 9th, with no ceasefire in sight. If this kind of layered analysis, the kind that connects what the live coverage leaves scattered, is what you come here for, drop a comment right now. Which Gulf state do you think declares force majeure next? Hit the like button too. It genuinely helps this reach people trying to understand what is actually moving in global energy right now, because next, we break down exactly what the Bapco shutdown means for refined product markets worldwide and which countries are most exposed. And we look at what Iran's targeting pattern across Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain is actually telling us about where this campaign is heading. Stay with me. Here is what changes everything about how you read the Bapco story, and why what we are watching is not actually about Bahrain at all. 10 days in, Iranian strikes have hit energy infrastructure across 6 Gulf countries: Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, all targeted. No conflict in modern energy history has done this. Robin Mills, CEO of Qamar Energy in Dubai, put it directly. There is no precedent for a region-wide conflict hitting all facility types across this many countries simultaneously. That observation is critical because it reframes everything. What we are watching is not random retaliation. It is a sequenced campaign with a clear and consistent logic. Start with Qatar on March the 2nd. Drones hit Ras Laffan, the single largest LNG export facility on the planet, supplying roughly 1/5 of all global LNG production. Qatar Energy did not just pause shipments, it shut down entirely for the first time in the plant's 30-year operating history. The CEO himself made that call after emergency evacuations. European gas benchmark prices surged more than 50% within hours. Asian LNG spot prices jumped nearly 40%. One facility, one afternoon, and the entire global gas market repriced. Then Saudi Arabia. Ras Tanura, Aramco's largest refinery at 550,000 barrels per day, was forced to halt operations after drone debris triggered fires on March 2nd. It was hit again 2 days later. Then Kuwait. Then the UAE, a fire at the Musafah fuel terminal in Abu Dhabi, and debris hit the Fujairah terminal on the Gulf of Oman coast. Fujairah is not a random address. It is one of the few major export points that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Iran targeted it anyway. Analyst Torbjorn Soltvedt at Verisk Maplecroft described that choice precisely. Targeting Fujairah was not coincidence. It was attacking a potential rerouting option for oil trapped inside the Gulf. And then Bahrain on March 9th. The sequence is complete. Every major Gulf energy exporter has now been touched by this campaign in some form. In my view, the pattern here matters more than any individual strike. Iran is not trying to destroy Gulf infrastructure outright. It is demonstrating that no node of it is beyond reach. Each strike delivers the same message to a different audience, to tanker operators, to insurers, to long-term contract buyers, and to markets. Price and the risk. The route is contested. The result is visible right now. Producers are not cutting output by choice. Storage is filling, tankers are not moving, and Hormuz has effectively closed to commercial traffic. A source at a Gulf state oil company told Reuters, "At some point soon, everyone will also shut in if vessels do not come." That was said before Bapco even declared force majeure. Rystad Energy's Amir Zaman noted what markets are not yet pricing. Restarting shut-in oil fields takes time, weeks or months depending on the field type and how it was closed. That is the hidden second shock inside this story. The first is the disruption while the conflict runs. The second is the delayed restart. And that timeline has no fixed end date. CSIS notes global stockpiles are healthy. The OECD holds around 90 days of consumption in reserve, and the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has over 400 million barrels available. But CSIS draws one critical line. The problem is not a lack of oil. It is a lack of secure transportation out of the Persian Gulf. And that distinction changes what solutions are actually available. The Strait of Hormuz has never been formally closed, but on March 10th, it does not need to be, because the insurance market already closed it for most of the world. By March 5th, the leading maritime insurers, Guard, Scold, North Standard, the London P&I Club, and the American Club, all canceled war risk coverage for vessels in the Gulf. That single decision, made in offices in London and Oslo, did more to stop oil from moving than any missile could have done alone. Here is the mechanism most coverage misses. Tankers are not refusing because they physically cannot move. No shipowner risks a $100 million vessel without insurance in an active war zone. Before the war risk premiums for a Hormuz transit ran around 0.2% of vessel value per voyage. By March 3rd, they had jumped to 1%, roughly $1 million extra per trip. Then, effective March 5th, even those premiums became largely unavailable. The market did not reprice the risk. For most vessel categories, it simply walked away. Munro Anderson of Marine War Insurance specialist Vessel Protect described it directly. The market is facing a de facto closure, based primarily on perception of threat, not a physical blockade. That phrase is the key to understanding everything. Iran does not need to sink every tanker. It only needs ship owners to believe the next one might be theirs. The numbers on the water tell the story. By March 6th, only 44 to 45 ships had transited Hormuz since the start of the month, a 90% drop according to Lloyd's List Intelligence. Over 150 tankers sat anchored outside the strait. More than 170 container vessels were trapped inside the Gulf. Maersk, MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, and CMA-CGM all suspended Gulf operations. VLCC supertanker rates, the vessels that carry 2 million barrels of Gulf crude to Asia, hit an all-time record of $423,730 per day on March 3rd, a 94% jump in a single session, per LSEG data. Washington responded on March 3rd. Trump ordered the U.S. Development Finance Corporation to provide up to $20 billion in political risk reinsurance for maritime trade through the Gulf. J.P. Morgan analysts identified the gap immediately. 329 vessels in the Gulf require full coverage, hull, cargo, liability, and pollution, implying around $352 billion in total market exposure. The DFC's $20 billion covers roughly 5% of that figure, and the program makes no mention of environmental liability, the coverage gap that keeps most ship owners on the sidelines. Now here's the detail most Western coverage is completely missing. While U.S. and European-flagged vessels sit idle, Chinese-owned ships have been transiting Hormuz by broadcasting their identity. On March 5th, a bulk carrier called Iron Maiden changed its AIS signal to read China owner as it transited the strait hugging the Omani coastline. It passed through without incident. On March 7th, a second vessel, the Liberia-flagged Sino Ocean, broadcast China owner all crew and exited the strait after collecting cargo from a UAE port. It passed through too. Iran announced on March 5th it would keep Hormuz closed only to ships linked to the U.S., Israel, and their Western allies, leaving a deliberate corridor open for Chinese vessels. That carve-out is not a coincidence. China is Iran's largest oil buyer and most important diplomatic partner. The message is geopolitical. The economic pain falls selectively on Western buyers. In my view, this selective closure transforms Hormuz from a global energy crisis into a targeted pressure campaign, one where the pain is distributed by political alignment, not geography. If the Strait of Hormuz stays closed for 3 weeks, Gulf oil production shuts down, not slows, shuts down. That is JP Morgan's baseline, published March 7th. Iraq was first. It cut 1.5 million barrels per day last week. Storage tanks were full. There was nowhere left to put the oil. Kuwait followed on March 7th. Its tanks hit capacity exactly on schedule. JP Morgan had given it an 18-day runway. The math was right to the day. Saudi Arabia began preemptive cuts by March 9th. It is redirecting crude to Yanbu on the Red Sea, but that pipeline caps at 5 million barrels. Saudi normally exports 6 million through Hormuz alone. Bloomberg this morning. Gulf cuts now total roughly 6% of global supply. JP Morgan warns the figure could reach 5 million barrels per day by end of next week. 5% of everything the world consumes, gone. Antoine Half of Kairos puts remaining Gulf storage at just over 100 million barrels, 1/3 of total capacity, and tanks rarely operate above 80% of nameplate. The clock is running in days, not months. This is the mechanism that turns a regional conflict into a global economic event, not the explosions, not the force majeure filings, the storage arithmetic. Here's what that looks like at the consumer level. The U.S. national average gasoline price hit $3.41 per gallon on March 8th per Edelais, a 43-cent increase in a single week. U.S. inflation stood at 2.4% in January, already above the Fed's 2% target. Janet Yellen said, Monday, the Iran situation puts the Fed even more on hold. Trump is simultaneously demanding rate cuts and running a war that makes them impossible. Bloomberg Economics called the Fed's position impossible. Higher oil lifts inflation up. That and lower rates cannot coexist. For Europe, Chatham House estimates inflation could run 1 point above forecast if prices hold. Bank of America warned European gas could break 60 euros per megawatt hour. Qatar's energy minister told the Financial Times on March 6th, oil could hit $150 in 2 to 3 weeks. That is not a fringe call. That is the sitting CEO of Qatar Energy, before Saudi Arabia started cutting. Ristad's Amir Zaman, restarting shut-in oil fields takes days, weeks, or months after conflict ends. The type of field, the age, the depth of the shutdown, all of it adds time. The damage does not stop when the shooting stops. The supply gap persists. The inflation persists. The insurance gap persists. What we are watching March 10th is not a war story. It is a supply chain collapse. And Bahrain's refinery is one line in a very long ledger. Force majeure is not a legal phrase. It is a confession that the system has exceeded its limits. The question is, how long the storage arithmetic runs before something larger breaks.